Those who may not know me, my name is Jeff Schabilion, and for over 40 years I was on the faculty at the University of Iowa, and I offered courses in botany, biology, geology, science education, ecology, and evolution, and so I've given a lot of lectures, certainly over 1,000 lectures in my career, and some were at national and even international meetings. But I have to admit, I'm more anxious about this presentation than any of them. This is my first PowerPoint presentation. All I can say is, may the force be with us, because when I was preparing lectures, including this one, the first thing I tried to do was think about what I want as the take-home messages. What do I want people to go home remembering? So about Iowa City's stone buildings, there are three things that I planned that you'd remember about. One was a grasp of the basic timing in which these were built, and it's not going to require, a lot of memory. There were three basic periods of building. One was at settlement time, very early on, the 1840s, 1850s. Stone buildings were going up. The next time was at the beginning of the 20th century, 1900 through 1910. There was another flurry of stone buildings. And the third time was associated with the Great Depression and Howard Moffitt's homes. So there are these three periods of stone buildings in Iowa City. The second thing I wanted to acquaint you with was something about architectural style. With a little bit of help, you should be able to look at a stone building anywhere in Iowa City and place it in time. And the third thing has to do with the stones themselves. What about kinds of stone? Well, the title says stone buildings, duh, they're all built of stone, right? But what I want to acquaint you with is that there's very different kinds of stones associated with different generations of stone buildings in Iowa City. And sometimes it's not even easy to recognize what is a stone building. So, no. Okay, here we have what appears to be a stone building. So, you're a pretty mature group. You probably would recognize, what kind of stone is this? Permastone, right. Patented, Permastone was patented in 1929, I believe. And it was sort of one of the early answers to the siding. Before aluminum siding, before vinyl siding, there was Permastone, to those who had the money. It's, those of you not familiar, it's kind of a cement product that's applied directly onto the surface of existing houses. And it is pretty permanent. This is probably done maybe as early as the 30s, 40s, and it still is in pretty good shape. The house, of course, is quite a bit older, judging by the nature of the window transoms and so forth. It's probably about turn of the century. Then it was modernized and upgraded. So this is not really a stone house. Next. And this isn't really a stone house either. This is a house, even though it's quite old, it is built of cast blocks. Basically, cement blocks that were made to look like stone. Although the foundation here, this across here, oops.
Someone is leaning on the wall.
The foundation is real stone. The rest of it is basically concrete block. Now, just as you might be fooled into thinking that a house is made of stone when it isn't. You could also be fooled in not being able to recognize a real stone house. This, despite its appearance, is a real stone house, quite an old one, but the stone has been covered over with a kind of stucco plastering, sometimes called rendering. And why would somebody do that? Well, because sometimes the stone doesn't weather very well. It gets kind of crumbly. This protects it. It also upgrades it, makes it cleaner, tidier, newer, more modern looking. And so, although in Iowa City there aren't many examples of rendered stone buildings, in different parts of the country it was quite popular to cover the old stone buildings with this sort of treatment. Okay, so now let's get down to business. Remember, the first thing I wanted to talk about is orienting you in time. So when I say settlement period, what I'm talking about is buildings that were built in the 1840s up through the 1850s. And of course, the absolutely iconic example of a stone building from that, next slide, is Old Capitol. Amazing building. When you think about it, when this building was going up, lots of houses in downtown Iowa City were log cabins. The Indians hadn't been driven west. I mean, it was right on the frontier. This was a frontier establishment, quite an ambitious undertaking. Okay. If you look at the first two stories, and particularly this center portico or porch, you certainly get the feeling of a Greek temple. It's not surprising then that this architectural style is called Greek Revival. So why people struggling on the western frontier in log cabins, why would they be building a Greek temple, a stone Greek temple? Well, it has to do with the idea of Greece as the cradle of democracy, civilization coming to the West. And it also is keeping up with your neighbors, because this building is very similar in many, many respects to the slightly older capital of Illinois. So what do we got here? Well, in the Greek Revival style, you obviously have, this temple look. Turns out that that's not so easy to do. The ancient Greeks in the Acropolis, thousands of years ago, managed to do it, but the technology and the stone and so forth available on the western frontier at that time was not always so conducive. And so, in a way, you have kind of little cheats. These are flattened pillars called pilasters or pilasters. And another example of kind of cheating is that the columns here, these stately Doric columns and the portico roof above it, are not stone at all. They're made of wood, and then they're rendered or plastered and painted to look like, to match the stone. They're not stone at all. Technical problems involved. Now, one of the main reasons or justifications for locating the territorial capital and the state capital in Iowa City was the availability of good building stone, because there wasn't railroads to transport things and so forth. So the local availability of building stone was very important in this period, but not without its problems. They couldn't make these columns, and there were other problems too, in that the local stone wasn't all as much as it had been cracked up to be. It wasn't as good as it was initially thought. And you can see here, this is the north side of Old Capitol. You can see a kind of painful example of a compromise that was made back then. The very local stone that was initially contracted, little quarries that like below the president's house and across the way and so forth, had stone that looked like this. And you can see it's quite dark, it's quite irregular on its surface. It's really not very good for building stone. And eventually, the contractors, the architects, the builders involved with this said, no, we're not going to accept that. Fortunately, a much better kind of stone was found not so far away, north of North Liberty, in the area which today is called Mahaffey's Bridge. A wonderful source of stone was found. This is all limestone, but this limestone at Mahaffey's Bridge was very uniform in its texture, very uniform in its color, and really held up well in weathering. And so all of the lighter colored stone that you see here, particularly like in this area and the corners and so forth and the water table, that's all Mahaffey Bridge limestone. Had to be moved down all the way from north of North Liberty, rafted in the winter on ice, floated down the river in the summer. I suppose some of it was moved by buckboard and things too, but yeah. Well, what do you do with the contracted stone that you already had told the local people you were going, well, here's a compromise. Compromise isn't always a good thing, right? So you can see the very local stone, which is dark and not very well suited, and then the Mahaffey Bridge limestone. While Oak Capitol was going up, there were homes being built, private individuals that wanted something better than a log cabin. Maybe I'll have to do it this way. And so here is probably the most ambitious stone house from this early settlement period. And it utilizes another type of stone. It really is a local stone, but it comes from quarries that were up where the Mayflower apartments were, that part. And it's not actually a limestone, it's a very fine-grained sandstone, which made it easier to cut into blocks and shape and all that, but it doesn't weather as well. And you can see it also is this kind of tan color. So if you look closely, there actually are two kinds of stone involved in this house. There is this tan sandstone, and then if you look closely, over the windows, over the doors, these headers or lintels, and below the windows, the sills, that's Mahaffey Bridge limestone. That's the good stuff. So strong, weathers well, and so forth. This house is a wonderful classic example of a residential Greek Revival stone building. And it echoes its New England predecessors. This kind of shape of house, building of a house, not the material so much, but the shape and the style and so forth, is like a New England salt box house from the 1700s. It's a very conservative look to it. You can see that the windows have numerous small panes. Glass was expensive. Glass was being handmade. So you had these little panes. And anybody that's had to clean these old-fashioned windows with these little, know why they're called panes, right? But they're beautiful, and they're an absolute part of the design, these little windows. Oak Capitol had them. I forgot to point that out to you, but all the windows in Oak Capitol have these little panes as well. Another feature, central door, and the door has these little windows, or lights as they're called, above it, and that allowed light to penetrate into the central hallway. back before you had electric light switch to turn the, Another interesting feature is both Old Capitol, and I again neglected to point this out, have what are called raised basements. The basements are not totally underground as they are today, but they protrude, they're raised partially. And this partial raising of the basement allows for these small ventilation windows. Lets a little air, lets a little light circulate in there so these floor joists there at that level don't rot away. In the back is another feature that's very common of the salt box style, and that is an addition of different material, frequently, because stone was expensive. Even stone that was not so good was expensive. This is an addition that's usually referred to as the kitchen addition in the rear. Another feature, very standard, is the 4 chimneys that you can see better at that end. They're all interior. There's no external expression of a chimney stack. They're all inside. Next time you look at Old Capitol, again, I forgot to mention to you, look at its 4 chimneys. They're all inside the wall. There's no external expression either. That's very common in the buildings of this, to have internal chimneys with no external expression. Okay, let's look at another one, just about around the corner. Sure.
Could you tell us what those little square doodads under the roof line are?
Well, those are a decorative feature. They partially support the edge of the eaves there, but mostly they're just to look nice, little brackets.
They're not glass or anything.
No, they're solid. And they're a little more decorative, a little more upscale. See, this was a very fine house in its time. As I understand it, one never knows about the validity of some of these stories, but as I understand, Governor Lucas, when he came, stayed there before he had his own digs.
It's my house.
Yes,
That's
yeah,
my
yeah.
building, actually. And I haven't heard the Governor Lucas story.
Okay.
But that is original cornice up there that you're referring to, the little wood blocks.
And I presume those are original windows, and if they're not,
No, they're not.
they're the right style. I mean, in terms of the number of, yeah, that's an 8/8. That was very common for, the proportions are very good for that. Okay, now we're ready for the next one. This is around the corner on Market. It's a little smaller, right? But you sure get the same idea, right? It's made of the same sandstone. It's got the raised basement, although the little windows are kind of blocked up. It's got the central door with its little windows above. And then, of course, since it is a smaller one, it's only got small windows up there on the second story. It's just a scaled-down version of the big salt box around the corner. Next slide. We've just come around to the side now, looking at it from the side, and you can see on this side, which would be the east side, there are no windows. And for this period of house, that's fairly common too. Remember, they didn't have central heating. It gets very cold in the winter, and windows are not always a good thing in the Iowa winters. Small rooms, it's hard to find places for furniture, and so it's not uncommon in these early houses to have walls that don't have any windows in them. There is one very unfortunate feature, though, about this house that disturbs anybody that's in historic preservation. If I had pointed out more carefully on Old Capitol and the one before, and talked about the little panes in the window, the little panes are gone. These are very inappropriate replacement windows, and they really do change the look, very unfortunately. And unfortunate too that even if you get good replacement windows, they aren't made of the same old glass and all that, so you always hold on to your windows if you can. The shutters are not likely to be original either.
Would they have pads?
Sometimes they had, like an O capital, the shutters are inside.
Repeat the question. For
Oh,
home.
she asked about the shutters, and I said, well, remember, I'm not really an architectural historian, but my take on that is yes, shutters were very common then, but sometimes they were done inside. In more sophisticated buildings like Old Capitol, the shutters are actually internal. So these are not functional shutters anymore, because otherwise you'd see the shutter guard where you lock them, and there's no hinging and shuttering there. But it could very well have been likely shutters on the original. Okay, moving along. Here's a house that's sort of intermediate in size between those two we looked at. This is where the university's press is housed. Now, quite a bit is known about this house. It clearly belongs to the right. Somebody's leaning on the lights. Deer in the headlight, deer in the headlight. It clearly is from this early period, and it is believed that some of this stone is limestone that was rejected from Old Capitol. It clearly has a couple different kinds of stones. The lintels and the sills are the good Mahaffey Bridge limestone, and the rest is the more local. You see the centrally located door, the light above it. Looks like a pretty standard settlement period house, except there's a couple things out of place, a couple things that are not right for the period, and it so happens they're actually photographs, early photographs. So this house has been changed. Can anyone spot the changes from what it would have been originally? Dormers, yes, these. And the dormers came about because the ridge line, the roof ridge line, was raised over 6 feet.
We gotta have some light on you, because you're live on the channel. Just keep talking. Just keep talking.
All right. Pay no attention to the. Okay, so the roof line was raised by 6 feet, right? So they built a new roof on it. So that's one, and put the dormers in. I must say, though, that they did a tasteful job, because you see these 6/6 little panes, then they copied that in the dormers. So that's nice. What else is not quite right? Big external chimney that goes up on the outside of the wall. That's not right either. So this is an example of very tasteful, I might add, remodeling. Purists would call it remodeling. But I think it's very handsome. And the whole intent was to bring this house, which was then an old house, in line with the colonial revival that was so popular in the 20s. So it was an updating by making the house even look older, trying to make it look even older. It's very nice.
Roofing material, slate or turn or?
Probably split. Oh, the question was, what was the original roofing material? And the shingling was probably split oak, could have been split cedar. Okay, moving along. I got to keep to my schedule here. Here we have an example of the smallest remaining little stone house from the settlement period. There were actually many of these scattered around Iowa City at one time, but one by one, because of their small size and other problems they have, they've been eliminated. So here we have sort of the minimalist example of the little salt box. We have the centrally located door with its little window above, but only 2 windows on the side. Here's the ventilation for the raised basement. Not only was this house minimal in terms of its size, and the kitchen addition on the back, not only was it minimal in terms of its size, but the selection of stone was minimal too. It has the poorest quality stone, and the next slide shows what happens to poor quality stone after 100 years of Iowa summers and winters. And you can see the very weathered surfaces and how generation of patching has come in. You know, probably should have gone over this 100 years ago with putting the plaster over the whole thing to kind of protect it. But okay, next slide. Moving ahead now, because we got to get to the Moffitts. Moving ahead now to the turn of the century. We're fast forwarding here 50 years in Iowa City history. 50 years make some big changes in terms of fashion. Fashion in clothing and fashion in architecture. By 1900, it was no longer fashionable, practical to use local stone in building, other than in foundations. They were still being used in foundations, but not in the main body of the house. It was cheaper, easier to use, you know, milled lumber and not to fool around. But stone hadn't totally gone out of fashion. By the turn of the century, an architectural style, which is sometimes called neoclassical, but the problem in calling it neoclassical is that the classical styles were constantly being reinvented. So it has its even more particular name, the French Beaux-Arts style. Where did this come from? Well, a series of World's Fairs and great exhibitions like the Columbian Exhibition and the Louisiana Purchase Exhibition. People went to Chicago and St. Louis and saw these incredible new neoclassical buildings of the Beaux-Arts style, and they were very impressed. And so the planners for the city and the planners for the university, the architects and so forth decided, we have to keep up with the times. We're going Beaux-Arts. Next slide. So here we have Old Capitol, which, thank goodness, was not torn down nor horribly remodeled. It's standing there with its new west portico added, which is a copy of the one on the east, so it's okay. But now it has 4 neighbors. So it constitutes what we call today the Pentacrest. And so all of these buildings have classical reference. But Old Capitol is that 1840s Greek revival. The ones on the corner are the new neoclassical or Beaux-Arts style. They're much larger buildings. They're much more sophisticated, as I'll show you. You can see this huge terrace that reaches across, monumental double stairs descending, balustrades. Beaux-Arts was not inexpensive. Let's take a look at the first of these Beaux-Arts buildings to be built was Schaefer Hall. If you're standing there looking at Old Capitol, Schaefer's the one to the left facing out on Clinton. This was the first one to be built, and kind of the prototype for the rest of them. It's huge. By comparison, Old Capitol just takes up about this much space. And you see it has a set of steps and a portico, temple-like portico, Ionic instead of Doric like Old Capitol, but, you know, reminiscent, right? You feel it's fundamentally very different, though, because all of these columns, freestanding columns, and the portico itself are made of stone. And the great darling of the Beaux-Arts movement was a special limestone from Indiana. And you took and you contracted to have the stones cut to specification, every stone cut to specification, loaded onto railroad cars and shipped to the site. Pretty impressive. And the Indiana limestone is, although some people feel it looks a little bit too much like concrete, but It's very, very uniform in color and texture. And yes, it is real stone. You can see the little fossils inside of it and all. So yes, it's real stone. So what do we got here in terms of Beaux-Arts? Well, these are real freestanding columns made of stone. Our old pilasters, our flattened pillars, are still here. In here you can see some good examples. Buildings are larger. The stone allows for much more sophisticated architectural and ornamental details. If you go around to the back side of this building, go ahead, to the back side, or the back side of the sister building, which is McBride Hall, you see these marvelous 4-story curved bays. There's classical reference for this, but very, very sophisticated to do everything on a curve, let me tell you. Kind of a Renaissance, Italian Renaissance thing to it. Look at how big the windows are, and look at the size of the panes of glass. There are multiple panes, but they're huge, huge by comparison. Lots and lots of detailing, capitals, and this horizontal banding with the beveling and so forth, so that you get a strong horizontal stone look, particularly at the corners. That kind of corner treatment with these stones is called coining. And so this wonderful fine-grained Indiana limestone allowed for not only these sophisticated architectural shapes, but beautiful detailed carving. Next slide, please. So, if you have never walked around McBride Hall and given it a careful look outside, I encourage you to do it, because it has a veritable natural history museum on the outside of the building. This is just one panel. As you go around the building, there's panels for reptiles, there's panels for fish, there's panels for mammals. All unique, specially designed carvings. They're magnificent. Here we have an alligator and a couple of iguanas, and on this side there's a rattlesnake. And frankly, the picture doesn't do justice for how marvelous these carvings are. And you go around, and there's ones for birds, and there's ones for fish, and it's absolutely fabulous what could be done with the Indiana limestone in terms of detailing. Next slide. Anybody recognize this building? This is on campus. We're still on university campus. It's what's called the old biology building, but when it was built, it was the new College of Medicine building. College of Medicine had money to build nice buildings even there. So you see the horizontal banding that's done by making the grooves in the stone. This, by the way, is granite on the bottom. Very upscale, a granite water table as it's called. And then you can see at each level here, just exquisite carvings. This faces out onto Jefferson Street. It's on the corner of Jefferson and Dubuque. And if you've never taken a close look at it, it's worth it to look at this side and then go around and look at the other side, because there's a whole different set of carvings on the other. Next slide, please.
Where did they get the granite?
Oh, where did they get the granite? I'm not sure. When you contract for a Beaux-Arts building, you know, all these, you're contracting for drawings that show each and every stone. So it was, I'm sure, part of the contract, there would be so many granite slabs of certain size to be put in there. But where it came from, I don't know. There's sources all the way from Texas to New England for granite. Where that came from, I don't know. Not local, not local. Okay, so the university got into Beaux-Arts in a big way, and of course the city is not to be left behind. So here are some of the city's Beaux-Arts buildings. What is this? Yes, I guess we have to call it the old post office now.
Government, not federal. Not
Okay, the post office. Yeah. And you can see some of the features here. Look at the size of these glass panes. The balustrade, look at that balustrade at the top of the building, and then go and look at the balustrade on the west terrace of Old Capitol. Right? They could have even used the same design. Another city building, next.
That's a city building.
Well, it once was. Right. Well, Carnegie Library. Yeah. Again, Indiana limestone. Look at the coins going up the corner. Look at the size of some of these glass panes, the freestanding columns here in the portico. Lovely laurel wreath up at the top. A monumental staircase turned sideways with two descending flights, just like the terrace at, below Old Capitol. Beaux-Arts. Very upscale. Very expensive. As far as I know, there were never any private Beaux-Arts buildings built in Iowa City. If you wanted to see a private Beaux-Arts building, you'd have to go to, well, Newport, Park Avenue, New York, whatever. Somewhere where people could have even spent millions, even in hard money, millions and millions of dollars to build a building in the Beaux-Arts style. So they're indicative of that period between the turn of the century and the roaring 20s and the good times. But then stopped, because the bad times came. And what's fascinating to me is that when the bad times came, it was almost a return to building using the local stone on small scale with local contractors and so forth. And that's where Mr. Moffett and his cottages enter in the late 30s and in the 40s. Next slide. So, who was this Howard Moffett? Well, he was an Iowa City businessman. I guess, give him his due, we might even call him an entrepreneur. When the hard times came, like so many other businessmen, he lost what had been very lucrative businesses. He had automotive parts, not only in Iowa City, but several other stores around the state. Bankrupt. He had sales of agricultural equipment. That didn't fare very well. He thought, well, how about, there's a lot of vacant store space downtown, how about I'll open up an indoor miniature golf course? You got to give him credit, but that didn't work out so well. A traveling rodeo show. Hard times. I think what kept him going for a long time was the delivery of coal. He was in that business too. He had his fingers in many pies. Eventually, he thought, there's a lot of unemployed people here, some of whom are skilled in construction. How about we build low-income rental housing? Sounded all familiar. Only he was doing it on his own nickel, not government money. So that's what he decided to do. Starting on a shoestring, they would build one little house and then rent it, use the money to build another house. And just like the Energizer Bunny, he just kept going and going until he had over 100 houses. 100 houses. The thing that's probably most remarkable about it is that they didn't all look alike, unlike many low-income housing projects. Not only didn't they all look alike, but some of them were fascinating. Among the earliest and most interesting of the houses he built were those that today we call the Moffitt stone cottages. And as you go down Muscatine, there are 5 of them in a row, just to the west of where Court Street and Ralston Creek cross Muscatine. And in fact, they represent a National Historic District, and they have their own sign. This is a close-up of the sign for Moffitt cottages, and if you've never gone over and read the sign and looked at the cottages, I'm here to tell you it's worth the time. It's very interesting. 5 of them in a row. No 2 are alike. And in fact, of the approximately 20 stone ones that he built, no 2 are anywhere alike. Each one is a unique enterprise. They used local stone in what's called a rubble stone construction. In other words, they did little, if any, modification to the stones. They picked up out of the river, out of abandoned quarries, out of old foundations. They just hauled them in and used them. And there must have been a pretty skilled mason involved because, as I'll show you, some of the results are quite lovely. So let's take a look. This is on the sign here. This is the first cottage. Show a picture of the first cottage. Here's the actual cottage. It's quite unique. It looks much smaller than it actually is because the long axis of this house is at right angles. It goes back towards the creek. One of the unique features, not to be repeated in any of his other houses, is the roof line. It's like it's been described as an overturned boat hull, right? It's curved, it curves. And then the split cedar shingles, not this re-roofing, but the previous one, not only were they of random size, but random staggering, so that they didn't look so much like shingles. The overall effect was very much like a thatched roof. And that's what these houses, these little stone cottages, are meant to evoke the 400 and 500-year-old little stone cottages in England, in what's called the Cotswold region of England. So here's this charming little cottage. What it has, and it's hard to see in this because the vine is covered up, but there's a massive fireplace that goes up outside on the outside. The windows have wooden headers, not stone headers, and the sills, instead of being made of fine Mahaffey Bridge limestone, are made up of a few pieces of the local. You can see there's several stones involved in the sills. Moffitt houses all have garages. He thought that was very important. He wanted a house that looked 500 years old, but was modern and had a garage and a flush toilet, and they all had little gravel or stone paths that led down to the front. Multiple pane. Now the trim here is dark, so it's hard to see, but this is a 6/6. I've almost gotten back to that settlement type, little paned windows and so on. If we move just further east, the next one, the second house. Oh, I'm sorry, good to remind, stay right there. This is a close-up of the stonework. I really need to comment how beautiful the stonework is. Remember, these are rough, really unshaped stones. As they picked them up, they used them. And you can see what they've used is large stones, and these, by the way, are fossils, the light, corals and shells. This is why it's called Coralville, right? Because the limestone there has so many corals and other fossils in it. So here's the local limestone, some bigger pieces, and then interspersed are these little guys. And every so often, there is, the mason laid up, a horizontal line. This is called rectification. And so if you look here, here's one of those rectification lines. If you look there, here's one of those rectification lines. If you look here, there's a rectification line. What your eye does when it looks at that, it senses this horizontality, which is good, because you don't want stone to, so you sense that horizontality, and then these little stones, it's just like little musical riffs in jazz. They go doodly doodly doo, doodly doodly doo. Charming, charming. Next one. Okay, so this is the next house along there. And it's got a lot of Moffett characters. Here's the little stone path leading up to the door. Here's the big chimney. Here are the windows with the little panes. Here's a dormer that still has the original cedar shingles on it. What we have here is a window, and just around this corner post is another window. So we have pairs of these corner windows. That's a feature found in many Moffitt houses too. And here, peeking around the corner, is the attached garage. The garage was always an integral part of the house. When I say attached, it's not just stuck on. The roof line always came down and incorporated the garage. Here's the third one, going east. Many interesting features here. You can see a dormer with cedar shingles. Same thing here. You can see the windows. This is an 8/8 pane, a little more ambitious. And then there are a number of kind of unique features. Next slide. Take a little closer look. Whoops. Yeah, whoops. Whoops. There we go. One of those features that's well shown here, and in many of his houses, are these sway back roofs. You see how the roof goes whoop out at the end. It's kind of, and if you saw the other gable at the other end, it's up too. So you get this sway back or saddle back look. What is that about? Poor construction? No, they worked very hard to get that look. They're copying, suggesting what those 400, 500-year-old cottages in England had, because they were roofed with stone shingles. And that tremendous weight of those stone shingles on those oak ridge poles, 500 years, you get the sway back look. So Moffett built that in to these. Here you can see the original cedar shingles, and even on this strange kind of bonnet over the front door. A unique treatment. Don't see that in any of his other houses. And the stonework is exquisite. Next one is a close-up. Okay, so what we have here are relatively small stones used throughout this house, and they're turned so that their narrow edge, not their flat surface like it's mostly been done on but their narrow edge is exposed. And the whole thing is highly rectified. See, your eyes go bling, 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 bling. If you kind of just loosely focus, you'd almost believe you're looking at a brick wall. You know, it's almost that regular. Small, horizontal, highly rectified stones. And even more unusual is the fact that you don't see any indication of mortar. It almost looks like they're just stacked there. This is what's called a recessed mortar. Yes, there's mortar, Virginia, but it's been carefully dug back in construction. So you get these strong shadow lines so that each little stone just jumps out and you see it, even from across the street. It's very time-consuming, very tedious. You have to select the stones right, you have to brush back the mortar, you have to rectify, you have to... For a rental house, it almost boggles imagination. Next slide, please. So here's the next house. Now, if I had this group in my classroom, I would be passing out paper and pencil and having each of you write a little essay for me on why you can recognize this as a Moffitt house. Fortunately for you, time is limited. And I don't want to stay upgrading all these papers anyway. So let's walk through here. How do we know that if this one was all by itself, how could we say, oh yeah, somewhere around town, we could say, oh, that's got to be a Moffitt house. Well, okay, there's the big chimney. Well, first of all, it's built of vernacular rubble limestone. Okay, that's a very unique feature in and of itself. It's got the little paned window. It's got the built-in garage. And as was often the case, these built-in garages were eventually converted into family rooms, laundry rooms, whatever. I'm not sure cars could fit in them, any of them anymore, but this one was very tastefully done because it still keeps the look of a garage or stable. You know those doors, though, are never going to open, right? These plantings in front of you. Nobody's going to drive a car in there anymore. What else? Oh, the lintel, the wooden lintel here with its trapezoid shape. Let's have a little closer look. Next slide. This is the gable end of that same house. You can see very nicely how the wooden lintels or headers of the window have these beveled edges, so you get a trapezoid shape to them, very Moffit-esque. Here there's, two at a corner, so you're going around the corner with that. Here you can see the stonework has certainly got the broad side of the stone facing out, and it's only very weakly rectified. You have a hard time seeing any exact horizontal lines across there. It's only weakly. So the stonework, even though it's same stone from Iowa River quarries and so forth, can be made to look very different by a skilled mason. Next slide. This is the last of those 5 houses. Whew, I'm glad he didn't build any more. This is the last. This is right up against Ralston Creek. All of these houses really have their backyards, if there is any, right at the edge of Ralston Creek. They've been flooded. Boy, if they had $1 for every time they were flooded. Fortunately, the catchment basins and so forth have limited flooding now, but they were constantly flooded. Moffett is believed to have bought this land at a sheriff's sale for a song because it was basically a swamp in there. Little house, but it's got 2 stone chimneys. Another kind of unique feature is that on each side of the door, it's not real clear, but if you look closely, there are 2 buttresses. There's a buttress on each side, an angled buttress that kind of comes out. Moffitt houses have minimal roof overhang, so there always was a problem of water coming down and getting into the basement. You can see they've tried to solve that here by putting this little cement apron. Next slide. This is another Moffitt house in the Longfellow neighborhood, just a couple blocks around the corner from the 5. This one you can see a really dramatic example of the upturned roofs. Look at that. That's not an accident. They had to really work for that. A few of them, when the houses were re-roofed, why the roofers said enough of this silliness and they've chomped them down so they're straight, but most of them had that sway back roof. Here's another interesting feature. The little porch roof here over the door is a curved extension of this. That's called a cat slide. Little cat slide there. I neglected to show you some of those on the others. Garage still being apparently used on this house. Let's go now from these houses in the Longfellow neighborhood across town to 5 or 6 blocks west of Sycamore Mall, because there is another group of stone Moffett houses there. Every bit as charming, every bit as unique, but rarely seen. And it's that group of houses over by Sycamore Mall that's going to be on the tour tomorrow. So let's take a look at them. Part of what's charming is that at the intersection of Friendly and Pickard, look it up in the phone book, at the intersection, about 5 blocks.
Online, they can look it up online.
Okay. There is a cluster of these stone Moffett houses, so instead of just getting them marching along in a row where you can't, the traffic's so heavy you just have to whiz by like on Muscatine, you can leisurely examine what looks like a whole little English stone cottage village. And so it's very nice. And here you can see 2 houses that are built kind of side by side, all with the usual Moffit-esque features. But here's another example of what happens when remodeling doesn't go true to form. Originally, and I remember that window well, it was gorgeous. It had 3 main sections. I think it was 4 over 6, 4 over 6, 4 over 6 with big dividing mullions in between. It was superb. Must have had a little bit of dry rot or something, and out it went. replaced by windows that don't even fit the space and certainly are not the small pane variety. So some people that are really, like me, that really get into the details of architecture go, oh no. Next, the house next door though is,
Is this right?
yes, the house next door is virtually perfect though in its presentation. It's a little bit bigger. You can see the dormers here, 6/6, the windows here, 8/8. Lovely cedar shingling, cat slide roof over the front door, paired windows at the corner. Probably the most unique feature, though, is how this massive external fireplace chimney was handled. You know, you'd expect it going up here. Obviously, it goes up through there, but the gable end actually has been extended over the face of it and then supported on these large brackets. A unique feature to this house here. And there is precedent in England for this kind of design. This is one of the houses that is definitely on the tour tomorrow. And if you think it's beautiful on the outside, wait till you see the inside. Next slide. This is a house across the street. This is one of Moffett at his most whimsical. Okay, you've been indoctrinated in Moffett now, so you know. Okay, this is a rubble stone, limestone rubble, limestone, massive chimney, pointy gables. It looks pretty typical Moffett. Till you start looking at some of the details, someone was having fun. Okay. See this little gable and this little window? What are they doing? That's a window into a closet. It's providing light into a closet. Okay. Now, you know I showed you the trapezoidal headers over the window. Well, this window has a trapezoidal header, but it's upside down. Yeah, right, it's turned upside down. The minimal eave overhang here, the barge board as it's called, you'd expect it to be smooth, but instead it's all covered with little decorative shingles right up into the gable. Very whimsical, very. Next slide. Across the street is this house. This is one of the few houses, as I understand it, that Moffett built under contract. In other words, this was a custom job. Somebody wanted him to build a house. And it's got some of the features. We see the stones laid on edge so they look almost like bricks. And the mortar is not quite as recessed as the one on Muscatine, but it's that same kind of style. This curve, reminiscent of medieval towers and things, but also of what was called an international style at that time. Next slide. This is one of the largest, and I think one of the most beautiful houses that Moffett ever built. You can see it has two chimneys, the massive one here, that one. All of the windows appear intact. Even the garage apparently is still functional. Beautiful house. Next slide. A little further down to the east, this charming little house. Here's its garage. Here's its massive chimney. Probably the most unique feature is these three brackets. What are they doing? Well, at the present time, nothing. But I'm sure when it was built, they supported a massive flower box, which undoubtedly had trapezoidal ends. Next slide. There's a number of houses. I can't talk about them all, but this one is much more unique in that it has a hipped roof. Next slide. This is pretty standard. This one allows you to see how absolutely minimal the roof overhangs are, right? Just minimal. which means if you aren't careful, you can get water dripped right down into your basement. This lovely house has an L-shaped plan, and it has these windows. You know, here's 3 of them together with the mullions in between. This is that one I was going on about. Oh, the window is... It would have looked very much like that if it was the... This house also has really exquisite stonework. Let's look at a close-up look at that quick. Wow. Look at that stonework. It's not highly rectified, right? You don't, instead you get like almost a jigsaw puzzle without the wiggles, right? Look at how the mortar lines are all so very thin. The stones were carefully chosen, many different sizes, large ones, small ones. They aren't all horizontally oriented by any means. Some of them are even triangular and all, but it all fit together perfectly. Beautiful example of masonry work. Next slide. Apparently, Moffitt's masons got tired of doing only one thing. They enjoyed a little variation and variety. So these are all stones about the size of your fist and kind of rounded. And you see, they all come out of the Iowa River and the quarries along the Iowa River, but you can see how very different they can be made to look. Now, getting down here to where I move along quickly, in the spirit of journalistic full compliance, I have to admit that I live in a Moffitt House. Next slide. And this is my house on Rundle Street, and I had felt moved to write an essay about what it's like living in a Moffitt House. And if I do say so myself, it's a very charming essay, and I was prepared to read it to you, but time doesn't allow. But I can tell you how you can see it. Next slide. Here's the reference. This issue of the palimpsest has 4 articles devoted to Moffett and his houses. So there's a wealth of information about Mr. Moffett. You want to know about Mr. Moffett? There's a big article about his life. Then there's a big article about his houses and how they fit into the times and their significance to the city and so forth. And then there's some short little essays about what it's like to live in a Moffett house. And one of those is mine. Go ahead. Now, I want to give special thanks to this gentleman, because without Ned's help, this PowerPoint presentation could never have occurred. You've been a wonderful audience. I hope to see many of you tomorrow on the tour. Bring an umbrella. Thank you very much.